Welcome back to the New Levels Coaching Podcast. I'm delighted to have a new guest who's making his debut on the New Levels Coaching Podcast this week. Remember, we are the endurance podcast who brings the endurance world lots of coaching, inspiration and education. I'm back in colder climates after a visit to Trans Gran Canaria, and this podcast this week is all about warmer climates, how we potentially train in that warmer weather, how performance slightly changes when it's hotter, and also what strategies we could potentially be looking at to help improve your performance in the heat. That leads me on to Doug, who is the guest for this week. Doug and I have met virtually numerous occasions because we've been in touch over the weekend when I was out in Trans, but I've also been doing Doug's research studies or been part of those research studies. Doug, I'm right in saying, Doug, you have an MSc from Stirling, is that right? Stirling University?
Yeah, that's correct. So I did the performance coaching Masters at Stirling University, which is a 2-year remote, 100% online Masters in performance coaching with coaches from all disciplines, from basketball, tennis, swimming, American football, all kinds of different sports there. And I was there to try and learn more about performance coaching.
Perfect. And that then led you to Loughborough, which is where we have met now at Loughborough University. So you're now studying a PhD. And again, that's more to do with remote coaching, I believe, and looking and exploring that remote coaching setting.
Yeah, correct. So I guess similar to yourself, I do remote coaching with endurance runners. And so I did the Masters, really enjoyed that. It was kind of eye-opening, the content. And then I was looking for the next opportunity. And so I contacted Professor Sophia Jowett, who's kind of the world-leading expert on coach-athlete relationships. And I put together a PhD proposal to her for her to supervise me around investigating the coach-athlete relationship in a remote online setting with endurance coaches. So I'm about halfway through.
How many years is that?
3 years. Halfway through time-wise.
Madness.
Time-wise. Progress-wise, we'll see, but yeah.
I always find that fascinating when people come and say, yeah, I'm halfway through my PhD. How long have you been going? 3-4 years. Wow. I think it shows the dedication to the research, though, and the literature that's published. A lot of people read this literature that eventually comes out, and they sometimes don't realise how much blood, sweat and tears has gone in behind the scenes to get that published. And I know you've had some research already published, which is great, which I've read about online.
Yeah, so my master's dissertation, we're lucky enough to get that published, exploring the role of the coach when working with ultra runners with relative energy deficiency in sport. So that came out last year, which was quite nice. And again, that was a good learning experience trying to get things published and what you originally write after it's been reviewed and changed and things, and getting it kind of journal ready versus the original manuscript can be quite different. So
I bet.
Yeah.
I bet. Well, I'll put a link to that article, that journal article in the show notes, because I think it's a really good read for people, not just coaches. I think it's a really good read for people in general. But I know I had a quick look at that article and looked at the findings of it, and it's fascinating. So looking at REDS and particularly that coach-athlete relationship, which I think, people are quite open about that. That's sometimes a struggle for people to be open and honest about that. So yeah, some fascinating research done. And then our paths have crossed in the coaching world, as you said.
Yep.
You are the founder of a very multidimensional team with the elite trail team that you've brought together a real core group of experts. And if anybody gets a chance to have a look on the website, the ETT website, I think it's fascinating the people who are involved in that team. And that team are now looking after a group of athletes who are at the top end of the sport. And at the weekend, I was watching some of them on the course and feeding back to you via WhatsApp as to what was going on. And I can imagine you were biting your nails at home and following the dots on the trackers, which we all do as coaches. But yeah, just share with us a little bit more about that team and how that came to fruition.
Yeah, so I was working with a number of elite ultra runners, and we had some really great success in terms of we had a top 10 at UTMB, top 2 at Lavaredo, some of these big races, win at 100 miles of Istria, Golden Trail Series champions in terms of the UK and things like that. And I was thinking there must be more support that I can offer these runners. And so I started speaking to a sports psychologist, speaking to a dietitian, and then thought, looking at the professional cycling model where a lot of the athletes train remotely, they come together to race, which is obviously different from an individual sport like trail and ultra running. But other than that, kind of that support system. So yeah, I wanted to create a multidisciplinary support team to support the runners. So we're trying to look at all areas of performance, from biomechanics, got physiotherapists involved, who I hope that we don't have to use very often. But yeah, nutrition, sleep expert, because again, not just for travel, but you mentioned Gran Canaria. One of my runners was away for a wedding in Bangladesh the week before, so we had a jet lag strategy for going there and then coming back. So little things like that, and it's just trying to provide as much support for the athletes, because a lot of these guys at the top end have trained for years. The gains that I can maybe get from a training plan will be minimal. So, but there's lots of little opportunities, and it's trying to provide that support for them. So that's where it came from. And then the other aspect was just trying to share that knowledge, which I think is why you kind of contacted me around with other runners, kind of best practice, because and I know that's part of the purpose for this, is to be sharing accurate information versus a lot of the stuff that's out there. So that was the other kind of element. We want to share that information with runners that are interested around performance, and create almost a resource on the website where they can go on and learn more about what are the top guys doing, what are we doing with them. So that's kind of the rationale for it.
I think it's a cracking idea. I really like the way you said you've taken that cycling approach and brought it into the trail and ultra world. And I think there is a crossover, particularly with trail and ultra and cycling now. There's a lot of literature out there where trail and ultra coaches, or certainly I do, but a lot of the studies have been done on cyclists first, and then we try and apply it to that same world. What I loved about the team was seeing familiar faces on there. So my old S&C coach, Rich Blagrove, was on there. Yeah. My old physio, Chris Brammer's on there, who I also worked with Chris with biomechanics. So I was looking at it thinking, God, this makes sense to me. I know these people, and if I haven't worked with them directly, I think Rebecca Dent's on there as well.
Rebecca Dent's a sports dietitian. Yeah. We've got Dr. Josephine Perry, sports psychologist, and then Charlotte, who's she's a sleep expert, and Charlotte's run CCC.
Amazing.
She does the research at UTMB on sleep, so she knows the demands of the events. Josie's worked with lots of ultra runners. She understands the demands. Rebecca works with lots of ultra runners, mountaineers, so she understands the difference maybe between that and a road marathon. So that was kind of looking for people who would appreciate the sport, I guess, as well, and had an understanding of that.
Yeah. And I looked at that team and I thought, I've either worked with them directly myself in my own athletics career, or I still refer people to them now as athletes and as a coach. But I also recognize a lot of the names, as you say, from the trail and ultra world. And I think I looked at it and thought, this is a really strong team, not just the athletes, the support team.
Yeah.
And that's what I really liked about it. And as you quite rightly say, the purpose of your team is not just about the performance of the athletes, is to educate the wider audience as well on what you're doing, why you're doing that. And I'm a strong believer, and I think you're the same, Doug, is that a lot of people out there look at elites and they think, oh, they're a lot different and we can't learn from them. But there's actually a lot you can learn from them that you can then apply to your own performance. And you've opened up a bit of a gateway there with the website to say, well, this is what we're looking at, this is why we're looking at it, and you could be accessing some of this as well.
Yeah, and I think that people might be surprised at the volumes that some of the runners do. It's not masses, actually. I have other athletes I work with who have full-time jobs, and they're running more. They're maybe slightly more serious in their approach as well than some of their guys, which I work with.
I can vouch for that as well.
Yeah, so it's trying to raise their professionalism a little bit, and helping with that support. So
it's an interesting one, isn't it? We have this debate a lot, and I think Tom Evans recently said something about people say talent will only get you so far. Talent still has to work hard, and people who have talent, the people who work hard, will always just beat the talented athletes. And I think that's right in some respects. Is talent does get people so far, but and I'm speaking from my own personal perspective here, as I matured, as I got older and in my late 20s and early 30s, I started to recognise that there's a lot more to this game than just training. And I think people mature and they start to look at things, and being more professional is then... It's not just about the 1% that the likes of Dave Brailsford's bang on about. It's more than that. It's applying yourself in the right way to get the best out of yourself. And that's why sometimes the talent of the athletes at the top, they don't have to train maybe as much. But some of them don't apply themselves as well as people think. I'm sure you found the same as well.
Absolutely. Not naming any names. And the other thing, though, I think that's quite important, which is maybe slightly different from some of the shorter distances, but even just like the marathon at Gran Canaria, 46 kilometers, but the actual time for the winners was significantly longer than a road marathon.
Yeah.
The time for things to go wrong and how they manage that, and the opportunities that also arise in a race like that. And once you go out to 100 miles, it's who slows the least, and what can we do to reduce their perception of effort in the second half of the race. And I was really happy to see that all my runners, between the final checkpoint, the final timing point, and the finish, all improved their position. So at the end of the race, when it matters, they were moving faster than their competitors. They may still be slower than they were at the start of the race, but relative to those around them, they're faster. So it's trying to look at all those little opportunities and trying to minimize the negative impact throughout the race so they feel fresher or they feel better and perception of effort's lower when you get to the end, so they can push that bit harder.
Fascinating. That, I think, I'll be honest, that's what's drawn me into this world. So, we've met over the last year, Doug, but before that I was very much track, road orientated, and the last 18 months of my coaching journey has very much been focused on trails and ultra. And I think the reason for that is because I was actually chatting to one of your athletes, Chris, out in Gran Canaria. I think he's on a similar journey to me. He's still an athlete, I'm a coach, but we were saying similar things in a sense of we love everything that's new. We love learning new things, and we feel like we're very experienced in the track and road world, but almost this exploration of a new event is exciting, and it really kind of gets my juices flowing at learning about all of this. But ultimately what it comes down to is there's so many different dimensions to it, and that's what I find fascinating. Yeah. Whereas with a 5K, obviously, yes, there's a lot of dimensions still into 5K, but if you're fit, if you're firing all cylinders and you go and run a 5K, a lot of it's going to come down to physiology on the day and who's physiologically the best. Whereas those 100 milers that I was watching at the weekend, one of the big things that we're here to talk about was the heat was playing a massive factor in that. Yeah. And people's strategies around the heat, not just the fueling strategies, but what they've done before, what are they doing during. And I think that's what opens the door for people. I tend to call it just levels the playing field a little bit. People can do almost outperform themselves, and that's what I love about it.
Yeah, well, I think before you started recording, you mentioned one runner was 90th at the first timing point and finished around 10th position in the race.
Yeah.
It's not often you see that in a road marathon. You kind of have the lead pack and then they're sort of there, and one by one they sort of slow down and not able to stick with the pace. But yeah, there's all those kind of opportunities which arise, and being in a position as a runner at some point in the race to take that opportunity. And I think it's changed in the last probably 4 or 5 years that we're now seeing people actively racing and making tactical decisions to put an effort in some of these longer races. Whereas before, I think it was more, I'm just going to go and run the best time I think I can, and the outcome will be what it is. But now we're seeing at the front end that people are making tactical decisions. They know that they might be slightly stronger than the competitor on a climb, so they put a real effort in to try and break them at those points. And it's getting really interesting as the sport keeps developing and evolving, that we're seeing these more depth of competition, and just the racing's getting more and more competitive. And year after year, course records are getting broken.
Yeah. And I could see that visibly at the weekend. You could see the depth, particularly in the marathon. You stood there and people are coming through, and you're looking down the field thinking that's a high class athlete there who's in 10th, and they're struggling here. You could see visibly they were struggling, and the field across the board, there was shorter races, longer distances. So we had everything from the 20k all the way up to 120k plus. So there was a lot of different races, but the depth in all those races was strong. That's not like a marathon where everybody's just standing on the same start line. This is 4 or 5 different start lines across the week, but they were still all really strong. So I think the depth is getting stronger. So with all those things as kind of our setup for our conversation, one of the first things I said to you when I was texting you was, by God, Doug, this is hot. It taken me a little bit by surprise. So James, who I was out there with, was originally meant to be running Gran Canaria. And when we first looked at the forecast for Gran Canaria around that time of year, we were expecting something around 20. Quite far out. We thought if it gets up to high 20s, that's unusual. Somewhere around 20 is ballpark that time of year. It might creep up a little bit during the day. When we were out there, to give people a bit of perspective here, I think we were on course and we seen 29:30 on our car, and people were reporting that it was getting up into the 30s. Now, as British competitors, that's very unusual for February time of year.
Yeah.
So let's start by saying, were you aware that the temperatures were going to be that hot as a coach? And if so, what do you know about heat, which then influenced your decision around the type of training that they were going to do into the event?
Yeah, so of course I knew it was going to be that hot. Yeah, absolutely. No, again, like you, I was looking at historical weather, and yeah, I did a race in southern Spain early last year, and I was kind of going through a bit of a heat protocol, which I'm sure we'll get onto. And again, it was kind of the temperature had been forecast to be low 20s, and race day it was roasting, and unfortunately one of the British competitors collapsed with heat stress, which some people. And at the optimal time in an aid station, her body obviously knew that was the time to stop. But I was out there experimenting. I'd frozen bottles. I tried putting some gels in the freezer around the race pack, trying to work out how to keep myself cool in the race as well. And so I was aware that although it was saying it would be potentially low 20s, that there was a chance that it could be in the 30s, especially at the end when they're going to be at their most fatigued. So the course profile for most of the races, and certainly the ones I had people running in, was they would be starting, climbing up, and then descending down to sea level for the final fast riverbed section where there's no shade or very little shade, and they're finishing typically sort of in the middle of the day, early afternoon, so they're going to be getting the worst of the heat as well. And so I took that into consideration when we're coming up with a strategy as to what we would do to try and prepare the runners. And yeah, two of them are training up in Scotland, so we're now in the warmth of Loughborough, but yeah, for them it's probably a couple of degrees cooler. And Meryl Cooper was one of the runners, and if you follow her on Instagram or Strava, you'll see that all of her long runs, I think her last 3 long runs, was in the snow.
I saw that.
Because we're trying to get elevation, and it's like, where's the elevation? It's snow up there. And then we're preparing for dry, dusty conditions in snow.
And just to set the scene here a little bit, you mentioned the riverbed, which we had, I wouldn't say the privilege of doing a tempo on, it was far from that. But I'll go on to that in a second. But it was a dry riverbed. There was nothing in it. It was just stones and rocks. And they were obviously descending down this. And Gemma and I did a session on it because I was trying to get Gemma better at technically navigating those sections. Whether she does that race in the future, we're just working a lot on the technical aspects of running more efficiently on that type of terrain at the minute. And one thing that I took from it was I kind of ran out and I was finding my footing a little bit. And on the way back, Gemma and I were significantly faster. Now, that was a little bit because, as you've highlighted here, Doug, it was a downhill section. So we climbed out and then we came down and we were following the course down this riverbed. But the other thing was that we were learning as we went and we were getting better and more efficient on that terrain. And it was quite clear that a lot of the Spaniards knew the course and they knew what was coming. Whereas Chris, an athlete who you coach, passed us with about 2K to go. And I think he said, this is deeply unpleasant. And I know he found it tricky on that type of terrain. So it wasn't just the kind of heat they were struggling with. It was also that terrain underfoot as well. But you're absolutely right. It just felt so exposed out there with it being dry, sandy, rocky. There was no hiding from the sun, and it did feel like, even stood there, it felt like extreme heat. So with people like Meryl and Chris who are up in Scotland, what sort of things could you do to help them prepare for that heat, because you were aware of it before they went out?
Yeah, so there's a number of different elements. So you have what we call heat acclimatization, which is if you went out to that natural environment and trained in hot weather. Now that can be hard to do if you're working full time as they do. And so you can't go and spend weeks and weeks out there. I know that some of the runners were. If you look at the people they were competing with, were spending weeks in southern Spain or actually on the island getting used to the heat. The other one, so you've got the acclimatization piece, and then you've got the acclimation, which is something which you can do in kind of an artificial environment. So there's various elements linked to that, and that's the route we went down, because you can do it at home or do it at a gym and things like that. And there's a few components. One would be making use of saunas. So you just like a sauna protocol where you spend time in amassed time in a sauna, or sitting in a hot bath as a second option, and maybe more easy to implement for a lot of people if they have a bath at home. And thirdly, running ideally in a hotter, like a treadmill in a gym, but even outside, but with more clothes on. So you might have seen certain brands sell heat suits, but you don't even need to have that, just a warm jumper. And they've found in research that was as effective as training in the hot environment, So there's various protocols that you can do. And with, I guess we want to get into kind of the specifics around that. So with Merrill, the research would kind of suggest that women need slightly longer to adapt to the heat than men.
Yeah.
And so with her and my female runners, unfortunately, they'll hate me for this, we'll have a longer preparation period. And it may be something like 3 weeks out, we start adding in after a run, spending 15 minutes in the sauna or 15 minutes in a hot bath, which is typically around 40 degrees is what most of the research has looked at. And then we build that up gradually till they're doing around 40 minutes sat in a hot bath. And they've found that for male athletes, if you spend 40 minutes sat in a hot bath, they did 3 days on, 2 days without it, another 3 days sat after a workout in a hot bath, they had a lot of the adaptations. With women, it might need to have 12 of those types of sessions.
Okay.
Or you can use the sauna from a similar perspective. So that was a combination of the two, either sitting in a hot bath normally after a run because your core temperature is already raised, or in the sauna, but it wouldn't be continuous in the sauna, probably stepping out, monitoring heart rate. You may look a bit odd if you're trying to monitor your core temperature. I have done that with an ear thermometer, seeing core temperature rise, but basically it's about just trying to keep your core temperature elevated for an extended period at the end of a run. And that can lead to adaptations which are beneficial in the heat. With the running in warm clothes, it's again maybe an hour easy run, because you've got to also consider as a coach, but also for self-coached athletes that might be listening to this, is that's an additional stress. When you come out of a hot bath, if it's at the right temperature, you'll be sweating for quite a long time after, and it is adding an additional stress. So you have to manage then the overall training load in conjunction with that.
So there's people at home probably sitting here thinking, well, this sounds quite nice, hot baths and saunas, and, I can get into this. But there's a reason we introduce it slowly and, as you said, starting off in the bath, for example, at 15 minutes and gradually increasing that to 40, because if you sit in a bath or in a sauna and you're looking at 40 degrees, it does become very uncomfortable quite quickly. It's not like your big bubble bath. It's, I've done it before where you are sweating in there, and that's the purpose of it, isn't it? To adjust. And
you don't really probably want to be drinking a lot of water, because then you're going to be cooling your core temperature. So again, and then even when you come out, not cooling yourself down instantly or a cold shower or anything, it's actually trying to just maintain more time at the elevated core temperatures. It's a gradual decrease and gradual rehydration afterwards.
And it's interesting because when I once ran in Belgium, and it was a bit of overheating, but it was something going on inside as well with my heart, and that they were refusing to give me cold water despite it. I was gagging for it. I was like, and they were saying, no, you need to bring that core temperature down naturally as well. It's a safer way of doing it. Don't shock the system right now by putting ice cold water in there. So there is that element to it as well. But as you say, you're getting those longer adaptations. So with this we're very good as humans at cooling ourselves down. So people often say, I struggle in the heat, but relatively we are all quite good at it naturally, because we're trying to regulate that core temperature, which is why we sweat to get rid of that heat. But there are certain people, certain body types, and depending on your background, that struggle more in the heat, or they certainly feel like they're doing. It can be a perception as well. So with this type of strategy, do we feel like, or does the science, let's go into a little bit of the science and the literature behind this, does the evidence support this for any type of runner? We're talking about not just at the elite end, this is for everyday runners who are maybe saying, well, I'm going to go out and do Boston Marathon in a few weeks, and that could be hot as well. Is this the sort of thing I need to be thinking about? Will I get the same benefits?
Yeah, so it's very individual in terms of the benefits or the response that you get. So, but overall, it seems to be applicable. A lot of the research varies with who they're using. So often you'll find people are kind of aged around 20 to 25, because it'll be a PhD carrying out the research, and the people around them are other PhDs which are available for volunteering for the research. But generally, the research would suggest that it works for most people, but it may take some people longer to get the adaptations, not just gender specific, but other elements may come into play as well around that. So yeah, that's one of the factors, and it's unfortunately a bit of trial and error from that side of things as to what works with you.
Yeah.
And there's not, as far as I'm aware, too much research looking at kind of combining various combinations, using a sauna one day, a hot bath the other, doing a hot run the next day. But from my experience, I think it's fine to have that mix as to what's most practical, because you don't want to have the hassle of having to always drive to a gym, for example, to get to a sauna. You don't want to miss out running on the trails if every single run's going to be on a treadmill. and then you're going to be losing maybe some of the skill and looking at the dry, dusty riverbed. And so there's things like that which you should factor in. But generally, I think for most runners, they'll see benefits of it. And one of the outcomes may be an increased sweat rate, which is something worth considering as well. So part of the reason for doing this is that it increases hemoglobin mass, and it also increases your sweat rate because you become more efficient at cooling yourself, which then means you have to factor that into your hydration plans, because if you all of a sudden find you're sweating a bit more, how much are you drinking? Are you compensating for that extra sweat rate?
Yeah, and that again tends to link back to hydration and maybe even sodium loading. I'm a very salty sweater. Like, I know that I've got to be on top of that, so that might have a detrimental effect on me. So the benefits I've tried to get from heat acclimatization would be then very different in this sense of, well, I'm better now in the heat, but I'm sweating more and I've not accounted for that. So I could then start cramping, for example.
Yeah, you could get more dehydrated potentially, but you'd hope that you'd be more comfortable in the heat and dealing with it and have a slightly lower core temperature as you start the race and things.
And with this, so you also coached numerous endurance athletes, not just in ultra. I believe you coach triathletes as well.
Yeah, I've got a few triathletes, yeah.
So with these, longer events, so we're talking ultras, triathlon, like particularly the Ironman distance, they're going to be out for hours and hours and hours. So when we say, okay, well, we're going to, creep up to sort of 40 minutes for baths and saunas and an hour potentially for these runs, there might be people out there think, well, how is that going to work if I'm going to be out for, 15, 16 hours? So what is the effect? What's actually happening? What scientifically, you mentioned a couple of things there that will help, but scientifically, what happens to us that's going to help us in that heat?
Yeah, so the goal is to basically amass the time, and over time, I believe your kind of just resting core temperature may be slightly lower as part of that, as your body's adapting to the heat, but it's becoming more efficient at cooling. So ultimately, you're maybe slightly increased sweat rate. As a result of the adaptations, you're just going to be dealing with the heat in a more effective way. You've got more hemoglobin mass. So I know some people have looked at research in terms of looking at it from an altitude. So if you go up to altitude, one of the things you have is potentially an increase in hemoglobin mass if you respond to altitude. And it's a similar type impact that this has on that from doing the sauna protocol, the hot baths, wearing warm clothes. So that's one of the it's maybe slight performance enhancing. So even if it wasn't a hot day for racing, you may get a slight performance enhancement from doing that as a result of that increase in basically the amount of blood that's in your body, essentially.
So regardless, it could be a benefit even if we get cool race temperatures, because like you say, you've had that benefit of increased hemoglobin mass in the body. So there are benefits aside to just being ready or being better at cooling as well.
Yeah.
Perfect. And what is fascinating about these types of races as well is particularly the longer athletes. So I think you had Hugh, who was doing one of the longer events at the weekend. Yep. They set off in like horrific conditions at some point, and they were like in these 30-mile-an-hour winds and rain, and it was quite cool as well through the night. We noticed that when we were out there, and it wasn't until obviously the sunrise came up. So a lot of the longer athletes spent hours and hours in a lot of cooler conditions as well. But when that heat came up, it came up so intensely. It must have been quite a shock to go from those cool temperatures. And then I think it's worth saying as well, people are carrying things that I've always struggled with this, that ultimately make you a little bit hotter. Yep. So they've got their race kit on, and then they've obviously got a pack, and there's weight to that pack, and then they've got mandatory kit, which is also stuffed in there, and that can all add to heat on the body as well. But you came up with an actual strategy, which I'd like to chat a little bit more about now, as well, what can we do in the race to also help us? Because we were stood there and we said, well, what would you do? And we were saying, oh, well, I'd stuff ice in the back of my race pack. That's an advantage. And trying to come up with all these cool and crazy, concepts. And you've mentioned a couple already, but did the team have any strategies for in the race itself?
Yeah, so if you have a support crew, it can be a lot easier to implement some of these. And yeah, there's been various bits of research done looking at kind of pre-race cooling, which might be easier to implement, especially if you don't have a support crew. So they've looked at cooling. There was one piece of research looking at, I think, at 5K runners where they cooled their head, but the rest of the body remained in kind of ambient temperatures. but the core body temperature was lower when he cooled the head, and the 5K performance was improved than when he just had them sat, the whole body and their head sat at ambient temperatures. So you can do things, especially around the head. The neck seems to be popular when you see people running, say, Western States, famously hot, they have ice bandanas. So we have worked in various hot races. So I had one runner racing in Thailand last December. We were using ice, so in the race vest, around their neck, ice bandanas, under their hats, all those types of things. So trying to actively cool. And some of the other researchers looked at, so within race cooling as well. And there's definitely benefits of it. Does work. It reduces your core temperature. I mean, most people have found that. And generally, the research seems to look at either kind of external to the body, so ice or cooling on the head, around the neck, those types of places, or ingesting things like ice slushies.
I've seen that's become more popular, hasn't it, recently?
Yeah. And there's been a lot. Felipe Gana, when he was doing his 1 hour world record on the track, on the bike cyclist for Team Ineos, there's a video out there, and Dan Bingham, who was working with him, who was a previous record holder, I believe, following track cycling very closely, but they ate a lot of ice slushy before they got on the bike.
Interesting.
I think he had over kilos of ice slushy to try and get himself beforehand, just to get his core temperature as low as possible. Because I think, don't get me, I'm not 100% sure in this, but I think having a warmer track, the air density is thinner, so they'll go faster. So they were trying to cool him before he got on the bike, and then basically having it in a slightly warmer condition. So you can ingestion of cold liquids or external ice around the neck and the head seems to be two of the most effective ways. And that's something we did. So Chris and Merrill had support at around the halfway point. Yeah. So I made sure they had some ice available and trying to just get cold water over the heads, drinking some. I've tried to bits and pieces, as I mentioned, just kind of self-experimentation with frozen bottles in the running vest on your front. I didn't personally feel that was very cooling. I didn't feel it very much, so I had it out and had it when it was getting a bit softer, one of the soft flasks, I just put it around the back of my neck and one of the climbs and rubbing my forehead and things, and that felt as a sensation more cooling than having it on the front. But it probably was still having a small impact. I couldn't feel it in my non-scientific research.
Interesting. This is fascinating for me. The first thing I'm going to pick away from it is that we said the research right at the start there, you highlighted that one study was done on 5K runners. So we're saying, even if you're listening to this and you're not an ultra runner, there are benefits if you're running 5Ks in hot conditions to be keeping yourself cool. Yeah. And that goes all the way up to these ultra distances as well. It's still applicable. So there are some performance benefits there. I'm glad you've said about the cooling strategies for 5K, because that was the distance I eventually went to. My strategy was I used to put my cap in the freezer. So I used to wet my cap, I used to put it in the freezer, and then last minute I'd take it out with me. I'd try and keep it as cool as I possibly could, and then I'd wrap it also in a cold towel, and then when I got to the track, I'd put it on in the hot conditions. I'd keep it on as long as I could do. But for my 5K personal best, it was around 29, 30 degrees in Oudegem in Belgium that night, and I specifically remembering that I left my vest off as long as I could. I actually went onto the track in just my shorts with a cold towel around my neck to try and keep myself cool for as long as I possibly could. And that still is my personal best to this day. So I was consciously thinking about these sort of things. I was fortunate that I'd been on camps with kind of Steve Ingham and Barry Fudge and people like that in the past who'd given us these strategies, and in some ways we were guinea pigs for them, as you mentioned, as students. But I used to find that sort of stuff fascinating because I felt like I learned so much from it. But for people here listening in, there are things, when we've got support, it's a lot easier. You're right in saying I was at Tunte where there was support and you could see people were grabbing stuff off everybody. But if people don't have support, there are also things that they can be thinking about, particularly beforehand, and keeping cool.
Yeah, I guess you can almost do the pre-cooling will have a benefit. Although, as you said, those guys some of them started. So, Hugh was racing in the 84K, so they started quite early in the morning. And then the 1 to 6 kilometre race, so the classic, started at 11:59 p.m.
Yeah, I thought it was quite accurate.
It can't start at midnight because I'm sure people have shown up the day before and the day after, not quite sure if it was midnight when. So 11:59 p.m. They had really tough conditions. So pre-cooling there maybe won't be as advantageous, but there's still probably benefits for a lot of people if you're looking at that. And again, kind of touching on something you mentioned right at the start in that professional cycling model, if you look at Tour de France and hot stages, the cyclists are all wearing these kind of ice vests beforehand just to try and keep themselves cool before they get on the bike, especially on time trials when they're just going, very controlled, managed, but maximum effort that they can sustain for whatever the length of that time trial is. So yeah, there's various things that you can do, and I've tried freezing. Well, I put gels in the freezer, and I had those, so I had the vest, so I was almost trying to replicate an ice vest. So I had frozen bottles at the front, one across pocket at the lower back, and then ice frozen gels at at my sides. There's just to try and keep, again, that sort of keep myself a bit cooler. And then as it melted, it was quite nice to be drinking the water because it was slowly melting, so it was always quite cold what I was getting from those bottles. So there's little things like that you could still implement without having that support crew.
That's really interesting on the freezing of the gels and drinks. I really like the freeze of the drinks. Again, even for, if you're training in hotter climates, we've got a camp coming up in Portugal and we expect it to be warm, and we will encourage people to freeze their drinks and take them to the track. And it's something just nice about getting that cold water into you during the session, but also just to tip it on the back of the neck. Yeah. That's always my favourite thing. It doesn't feel so nice at first, but then you're like, oh, I'm glad of that. And if you've got that in the race, then if you've completely frozen a flask over the duration of the race, it will obviously start to melt a little bit, but I imagine it stays cool for quite a long period of time in there. And then there's the element of the gels, and you're almost creating your own little ice slushies, particularly if you're ingesting that as well. There are aqua gels. I don't know if they would freeze. It's probably something I will try now off the back of this, Tug, so you've got my mind spinning.
I can tell you that I had the Morton gels, and they didn't really freeze when I tried them. And I'm aware that this brand, Never Second, do have an ice gel, and the purpose of that has been designed that you do freeze it. But I believe they say take it out about 5 minutes before you want to use it. So it's more designed, again, I think, for Tour de France cyclists with their support crews, with the soigneurs and the cars with freezers in it. But we did try that. We did try using that in Thailand with Robert. So he had his support crew there, and we tried using these ice gels there just to try and get something cold. So they had a cool box. Take it out when he came to aid station. So we only used it in the aid stations there, but it's having something cold, which is still simple to digest. We've been playing around with different things.
And I think this is it. A lot of elite sport is this. People think it's this. There is a scientific approach to it, of course there is, but there's a lot of trial and error that goes on as well with people, and often it's finding out what works for you. Going back to your point right at the start, it's very individual. Everything is very individual in this sport. This is what's so good about it, and it makes you unique, and we are also so unique. And sometimes people, I've read recently that these gel companies and nutritional companies are designing things that have like a mint taste to them, for example, or a lemon taste. I had a mint chew when I was out there, and that was quite refreshing. And I think that comes down to perception as well. And I know Alex Hutchinson's done a lot of work on this around the effect of placebo is often the most powerful effect of anything.
Yeah, I mean, they've done research with, I think, just like a simple mouthwash. Yes. And if you swirl it and then spit it out, but just the people's perception is then that they're cooler with the menthol from that. I guess one thing around anything that's influencing perception of temperature is it's not actually cooling the body. So it's just something you need to be mindful of, because then someone may push too hard if they're feeling better than they actually are in reality. But yeah, I've run with like the Fisherman Friends. So really strong menthol, trying to just use that and breathing through the nose, and it does kind of feel like cool when it's a strange sensation. But yeah, I've tried all these types of little things for hot races. But yeah, that's the one thing I say with perception, is just being mindful that you're not actively cooling. The other thing, which might be, I'm sure it's available on YouTube or somewhere, is if you look at last year's Trail and Mountain Running World Championships and Zach Miller. Yeah. It was in Innsbruck. They started off running through the mountains. They had a long descent into the valley floor, and it just got hotter and hotter. And at one aid station, Zach just got there and he was just chucking water over himself, literally just like 2 hands, like water all over him, just trying to get himself cool. It can be as simple as that. He performed well after that. And there's other stories about people in ultramarathons just lying down in a river.
Just trying to get themselves cool.
Just trying to get the core temperature down a little bit and then carrying on. So just even, water that isn't particularly chilled will just help cool the body down.
Couple of things to take from that. We seen Zach at the weekend, and my partner Gemma said to him as he crossed the dam, he wasn't having a particularly good race, Zach. I think he'd be first to admit that. But back to your point, Doug, he just completely soaked himself at that aid station. I mean, we watched him go in and he looked relatively dry. We watched him come out and he was absolutely drenched. So I think he did something similar. But Gemma made the comment to him and said, "Come on, Zach, you're looking good." And he turned to her and said, "Really?" She was a bit of a fangirl for Zach Miller, but yeah, he was having a tough day. And then back to the points around, you said about trialing these different things and finding what works for you. I think the perception thing is really important to highlight here, because one thing that stands out for me was the Callum Hawkins incident on the Gold Coast, where he was using ice hats and his team had planned for this, and Barry Fudge tells the story, and it, we shouldn't laugh about this story because it was very dangerous and it was very upsetting to watch, and I had money on Callum winning as well, which kind of kicked me in the teeth a little bit, but Barry said the problem that day was we gave a strategy to somebody where his perception was that he was still cool. And to add fire to the already these enlightened flames was that Callum is also a doubly hard bastard who will just keep running through anything. So he's just telling himself, "Yeah, I feel fine," and he's pushing and pushing and pushing. And then eventually we saw what happened, collapsing on the side of the road. So I think it is a really good point to note there around just be careful if your perception is telling you you're cool. Similar with your pacing strategy as well, linked to that.
Yeah, because obviously other things we've maybe not touched on as much, but yeah, pacing. So not going off too hard. If it's hotter, you probably have to be mindful of adjusting how fast you can run, because if it's hotter, your heart rate's going to be higher because it's trying to keep you cool. Yeah. And then hydration becomes very important as well. So having a good hydration plan will help keep your core temperature lower, and your heart rate will be lower because you're not getting dehydrated. So as you become dehydrated, your heart rate will drift up, your core temperature will be drifting up. Managing pace and hydration will be two key components, especially when it's hot. So if you've been training in winter in the UK and then going out to a hot climate like that, it's something to be really mindful of around how are you going to adjust to that. And one of the things did with the guys before they headed out was actually trying to get them to get used to drinking maybe a little bit more. So working with Rebecca, the dietitian, was like, actually get comfortable drinking more than you need on this run, because when you get out to the race, if you're used to drinking 500 ml an hour and all of a sudden you're drinking 650, 700 ml an hour, can your stomach cope with that extra volume that's going in? Yeah, because you might even need more than that when you get out there as well. Yeah, I think it's a really important point to make around that hydration. Some people, James will be first to admit, who I coach, he's guilty of this way. It's like, less the better, less I have to carry, I'm lighter, those sort of things. But we've both already said, we've got to account for Chamonix this year when he does OCC, that it can be hot. It was quite hot this year. We started off with snow at the start of the week, which was mad for the MCC, and then by the time we got to Thursday, it was roasting. So you've got to be mindful of that. And again, people, you're going. So I was going to say something I like flag, and Rebecca will flag, is a simple thing. You could do a sweat test where you run, weigh yourself naked before you run, then obviously get dressed. Don't go out. Do your run then, and you can drink and stuff. You just need to record the weight of what you've drunk, and then back and towel yourself down as well. So you're removing the sweat, and weigh yourself. Say you're running an hour around race intensity. Depending on the temperature, will have an impact, but it'll give you an idea. But coming back to worrying about carrying the extra weight, you're probably going to be sweating that out anyway. So if you're worrying about carrying 1 litre instead of 500 ml, you're probably going to lose half a kilogram, 500 ml of sweat anyway. So that's how I try and convince the guys that the performance detriment from being dehydrated is going to be much slower than the extra 500 ml that they're going to carry with them. Yeah, and I think it's always better to have a little bit more, because if you've not got it, you've not got it. Yeah. Like, if you don't use it, I'm not bothered about that. If you don't use it, if you don't feel like you need it, if you finish with a little bit of water, I'm not bothered that you've got an extra 250 ml that you've carried around with you. But if you're really struggling for something, then, and you're already dehydrated, there's that saying, if you think you're dehydrated, you're well dehydrated. At that point, there's going to be negative then performance consequences as a result of that. Yeah, I think that the hydration thing is a big thing for people. We do have a link with Precision Hydration. I find their website's really good for educational resources on there, and there's things you can put in as well, and calculators and things, and they have a really good sweat test. They've got a sweat test calculator on there and stuff. Yeah.
And I find that really useful. And again, whether you then purchase from them or another company, I think there's a lot of great companies out there, but I do believe we've got a relationship with Precision because I believe, similar to ourselves, our websites, they're providing education for people as well. So even if you just want to go and have a look at those resources, I do recommend people do that. Touching on that and link back to pacing then, Doug, because you have touched on a subject that I'm very passionate about, because I still watch those races at the weekend, and I still do believe that people go off too hard. And I believe if you can get that pacing right, there's a lot of places there up for grabs. But there are people who stand on a start line. I'm going to take a marathon here as an example. So I'm going to go slightly away from trail and ultra. London Marathon, I think it was either 2018, 2019, can't remember off the top of my head, where it was a really hot year. And I just got into the coaching world online at that point. And I was coaching a few athletes, and I'd said to them, look, it's really hot. It's forecast 25 in April in London. That's crazy. It's probably going to feel hotter in the actual race because you're going to get reflection off the tarmac, the buildings, all those things to be considered. And we need to change strategy. And people were coming back saying, well, I'm in shape to run a personal best. I can't change my strategy now. And getting that through to someone is really hard. But I did go on to coach an athlete who I wasn't coaching at the time, and he said to me that his best performance at London came on the hot year because he adapted his strategy. So he ran 4 minutes slower than his personal best. He ran a 3:03 marathon. His PB was 2:59. But it was his highest place finish at the London Marathon still because he was willing to adjust. But let's have a little bit of a scientific explanation for people so they understand why they need to slow down, because just hearing it from a coach saying slow down, don't go too fast, what's happening there? Why do they need to back off a little bit?
Well, yeah, and I think you mentioned the heat at Trans Gran Canaria and then comparing it to last year, and if you look at some of the winning times, especially in the marathon, which was when we were messaging quite a lot and you were saying it was sweltering, the same runner won both years, but he was a little bit slower this year. And it was interesting to see. Now, was that the heat? They always changed the course slightly. I think they had a slightly different start, so it didn't bunch up quite as much. So they maybe ran a little bit further. But overall, the time seemed to be a little bit slower on that race day, which was, I think, the hottest day of the weekend. So it's interesting seeing that. But ultimately, I think when the big thing that you probably notice is a higher heart rate for the pace that you're running at. So if you monitor your heart rate, you're running in hot conditions. So I have a couple of athletes in Dubai. We can't really train outside, but it can be as dramatic for them. If they do an outdoor run, when they're running zone 1 pace, they could be in heart rate zone 3 or heart rate zone 4 in the summer.
Wow.
So we can't use heart rate as a guide if we're trying to do some training. If we say, right, we want to go out and keep it easy, just use RPE or just run slowly, basically because of the heat. And that's part of the impact because it's the body's trying to cool you. It's trying to move the blood around the body, get the sweat going, and that's one of the biggest things that we can see easily in terms of the feeling of that. Also then linked with that is your core temperatures rising. You're going to be sweating more, trying to cool yourself, which means then if you start getting dehydrated because you're losing fluid through sweat, you're losing sodium through sweat, then all these factors come into play and ultimately you will slow down.
Yes.
So from a pacing perspective, you may have to go a little bit slower to be running at the same relative intensity that you're used to in cooler conditions.
Yeah.
And I guess one of the things like talking about if they go off too fast and things, one could argue that do you push hard at the start when it was cold? Because I'm not saying that's the right thing to do, but there's you can almost go, well, when's it going to be cooler, when it's going to be warmer? And that's one of the things that individuals, some people like running in the heat, some people don't like running in the heat. Yeah. And when we're doing 100-mile races, thinking something like UTMB, do you tactically say, right, we're going to push a little bit harder through the night? Or do you not? Or so there's all these kind of little things you have to kind of work with the athlete and the individual to work out when one should. But yeah, from a purely kind of physiology perspective, you're going to be basically hotter core temperature. You're going to have a higher heart rate for your same running speed. And then coming back to kind of the Alex Hutchinson and sort of psychology piece, your perception of effort will be higher for that same speed because you're feeling less comfortable.
Yeah, I read a study quite recently around the perception of effort in hotter climates, and it was significantly higher. People just feeling like they are working a lot harder, but they're at that same intensity level. And I think if we just strip it back to basics here, if we just view that heart as the muscle, that muscle is working so hard to regulate our core temperature that's why it's higher, as well as a lot of other things going on inside the body. But just simply, it's having to work harder at an even slower pace than it's used to, but it's because the intensity level is up because of the environmental conditions you get. The really interesting point about, again, linking it back to the longer races, you see a variety of conditions as we did at the weekend. And you're right, Doug, because the Courtney Dauwalter's time in the ladies race was significantly down on last year as well. I think it was close to an hour behind what she finished in last year, because I think the conditions on the whole, she even said it in her interview after, were quite tough during the day and in the night, but they did start in really cold conditions. Yeah. So you do have to think strategically about that.
They almost had the reverse. They had like really tough, I'm not going to say winter conditions, but I think it was strong winds and it was cold through the night, which wasn't favourable. And then by the time they're finishing, they had the heat. So they had a massive swing this year, whereas last year there was a smaller change from night to day in terms of temperature and just the general conditions.
But yeah, when people stand on that, back to that London example, I think I looked, the start temperature was around 19, 20 at that time of the day. And that was when they were going off on the gun. By the time you're through in the masses and you've been stood there for an hour waiting to get through, it's probably more like 22, 23. At that point, you've got to say, right, we've got to change tact here. Because as online coaches, and I always say this about training sessions, when we plan a session and if we've put pace prescriptions in there, I'm more of an RPE fan personally, but now and again I do put pace prescriptions in there. I plan that on the perfect day. I'm sat in the office thinking, right, if I get perfect conditions, but I do give a pace range, but it's amazing how many runners or how many athletes will go to the top end of that pace range first and not the bottom end. I'm guessing it's similar from your end.
Oh, yeah, the range, yeah. It's always at the top end of the zones or whatever it is, yeah.
Of course it is. And yet that zone is often so much bigger than they think it is, so you could be getting away with a little bit. But back to that point, if we give a pacing strategy on the day of the race, some people aren't prepared to go off that slow. I always say to the athletes I work with, if you're not prepared to go off that slow, what I'm setting you there, I'm going to take a number. I want you to go off at 8-minute miling, which is about 3.5 hours for the marathon. And I'd like you to try and, sustain that or potentially pick up, but let's just be a little bit safe. And I say, I can't go off that slow. My saying back to them is always, well, make sure at the end that we don't see anything above 8-minute miling, because if you're not prepared to go off that slow, you shouldn't be prepared to finish a lot slower than that. But what you do see is the drop off is so much more significant. The people who are steady away tend to be able to maintain that pace. People who've gone off too fast, in this example, 7:30-minute miling, well, we usually see them dropping like 9:30s in the end, and it's a real kind of drop off because they've completely bonked by that point. Yeah. So lots to take away. I mean, people are going to come off the back of this podcast thinking, well, this is great. I've got saunas to do. I've got hot baths to do. I can try out all these fueling strategies as well. These sound quite good. But to leave people with a few top tips to maybe think about, and we'll bounce off each other here, Doug. So if you were to give people a top tip and say, right, people have got a race coming up in the summer. They know right now, long-term plan, that it is coming up in the summer and they want to be a little bit more prepared for that. What would be one of your top tips to give them to start thinking about now?
Well, just because you mentioned it earlier about the training camp, I'm just going to say, like, one of the things you could as well, like the top tips or anything, you could implement that a little bit before a training camp in a hot environment as well, because then you may get more benefit of being on the camp. So it's something not just from a racing perspective, but if you're doing a training camp in a hot environment, something you could do. So I would say a couple of weeks out, I would look at implementing a heat protocol, heat mitigation strategy. So that could be looking at using the hot baths, the saunas, or training ideally in a kind of warmer environment, so it may be on a treadmill in warm clothing. And kind of what we said, work up to around 40 minutes is what most of the research is saying. So spending that amount of time sat in a hot bath after a run, and then slowly rehydrate and bring the core temperature down following that.
And how often were your athletes doing that, Doug, in a weekly period?
So it doesn't have to be continuous. It doesn't have to be every single day. So for female athletes, we'd be typically trying to get around 12 sessions in. So it might be kind of 15, 20 building up. So that might be over, say, 4 weeks.
Yep.
And doing maybe 3 days in a row, 1 day out.
Okay.
Of that. With the male athletes, typically would be looking for around 6 to 9 sessions of that kind of 40-minute duration in the hot bath. And then again, maybe 3 or 4 sessions prior to that where we go kind of 15, 20, 25, or sort of building up to that duration. But again, it can be 3 days on, 1 day out. That's what some of the research has shown. Or, just as and when it suits like their schedule. Because even 4 or 5, I think 5 sessions have been shown to be beneficial.
So minimum of 5 sessions can have some form of benefit.
Yeah.
Brill. Well, my go-to is going to be, again, I was going to say something similar about the training camp option, if you've got that option. But linked to that, if you're racing in the summer, quite often we do have spells or periods of time, even here in the UK, it gets quite hot. And naturally what the athletes do say, well, it's hot, I don't think I should go out today. And I say to them, well, actually, this is a really good opportunity to go out and get some training. However, what we are going to do is we're going to knock your pace back a little bit, and then, that comes back. But I don't want to go slower. Can I not just train when it's going to be a bit cooler? But again, just getting used to that environmental conditions. We do get it here in the UK. We definitely do. Particularly, I find a lot of people who target, say, a Berlin Marathon end of August, they have to train through a lot of hot weather here in the UK. But it can be beneficial because Berlin can get hot too. So my top tip would be, don't be afraid to train in the heat, whether it's on a camp or here in the UK. But if you're going to do that, make some considerations around your pacing. Also make some considerations around your fueling, which you highlight is a really important factor, both during if you're going long, but also then post run. A lot of people don't carry water bottles around with them and don't hydrate during the day. So just make sure that if you're sweating more, you are then replacing that fluid.
And that would be a perfect opportunity, one of those runs, to do your sweat test that we talked about, working out your fluid loss in that session in those environments. If you've only been training in the cool and you're losing 1 litre per hour at that intensity, it could be as much as 1.5, even more litres per hour if you're then doing it in the hot. So that'd be a good opportunity to get an extra benefit from that hot training session.
I was really surprised when we first did it with Steve over in Portugal, and we weighed ourselves beforehand. Thankfully, we didn't have to do it naked because we were all in the same room, but we were in the same kit, and we came back and we just did a general sweat test, and we were doing it throughout the training camp. But this particular run, I was really surprised that I'd lost almost 2 kilos on a run. I sweat a lot, and I'm a very salty sweater. That was a light bulb moment for me in my running. Oh my God, am I really losing this amount? I had to then think about that, and I'd still say I'm still playing around with it to this day, because as I go longer, I'm figuring out, oh God, I need to take on a lot more than other people, and it can be challenging. So you're right, Doug. If you can practice that strategy, or certainly give yourself a sweat test, then by all means take advantage of that. Just don't go out running naked. That's what we're saying.
Absolutely, yeah. And it's just so you don't have the weight of the sweat in your clothes. That's the reason. It's nothing perverted from the coaches.
Yeah, because the obviously the clothes are lighter at the start and they're heavier at the end. Brilliant. And then finally, I'm just going to give a bit of a mention to, some of our coaches and partners, people who we work with. So physiologists as well, going in the lab and doing some testing around that can be helpful if you've got access to that, or if you want to pay for that. That people do sweat testing in the lab, and it's very beneficial. Here at Loughborough, I know they do that. Dave, who's one of our coaches at New Levels Coaching, he does that sort of thing over at Birmingham. And again, it's not just for the elites, it's for anybody who's looking to find out a little bit more about that. If they feel like that could help you with your performance, then why not explore that? It could actually be making a big difference.
Yeah, we use the lab at Loughborough. They've got the chamber there where you can set it up to simulate the altitude, the humidity, the temperature of key races. So I've got 5 of the guys coming next month, and we're going to be simulating UTMB, CCC type conditions for them to work out the sweat rates in that environment. So yeah, there's lots of opportunities like that which can be useful for just managing your sweat. But as you say, it doesn't need to be in the lab. Even in a treadmill in a gym, if you know it's going to be a bit warmer, it'll give you some sort of indication, and you could even compare 10 degrees outdoors versus 20 degrees in the gym, and then going, right, if I'm racing in 25, kind of how's that looking in terms of the trend of the sweat loss?
Yeah. Just be careful who you do it around, because I like sweat crazily on a treadmill or on a bike, and people are looking at me like, my God, that's repulsive. And make sure you have a towel. Don't forget your gym towel for that one. Excellent. We've covered loads there, Doug. Thank you for your time. That's been fascinating. I feel like I've learned a lot from that conversation. Hopefully people tuning in, listening and watching on YouTube have learned a lot. There's a lot to take away. I'm going to pop quite a few links in the show notes if that's okay with you. I'll do the one to your original research study, and that was done at Stirling. Then I'm also going to put a link there to the latest article around how you implemented this heat strategy. I believe that's up now on the website.
Yeah, we've got a couple of articles there around heat mitigation, the impact of heat mitigation. We'll have another couple coming out in the next few weeks around hydration and the role of sodium as well. So we've got, there'll be more content coming out in the coming weeks.
Perfect. And if people want to get in touch with you, Doug, about coaching, where can they find you?
You want me to plug TMR?
That's absolutely fine.
Yeah,
absolutely.
So I've got TMR Coaching. So we're on Instagram or tmrcoaching.com, and be able to reach out to me there. And if they're interested in trail, ultra, we've also got cycling and triathlon coaches working with me.
Perfect. So TMR Coaching for Doug. Obviously, we are New Levels Coaching, but more than happy to promote other coaching companies as long as we believe in them. And as you know, I've had Doug on the podcast, massively believe in what he does as a coach and the work they're doing. And they're doing some fascinating work with the Elite Trail team. So do please keep an eye on that over the course of the year. We wish them all luck. And as always, we wish you luck if you're racing. Enjoy your training. Enjoy your racing. Good luck to all those going out to Tokyo this weekend. I know it's a very big weekend for a lot of marathon runners. We'll be keeping an eye on the tracker. Another weekend spent watching dots and watching results. Thanks again, Doug, and thanks everyone for joining us. Cheers, guys.